Now, in the early 1700s, as hard as it may be to believe, the population of the colonies was actually drifting from these strong Christian roots. Not anything like we see today in the 21st century, but it was a societal shift until something called the Great Awakening. I hope that you are familiar with names like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. These were the two most famous preachers of the Great Awakening, and this took place from the 1730s through the 1760s. Now, if you know anything about American history, you know that this is going to lead up to the 1770s, which is when the Revolution started. For some context, George Washington was born in 1732, and many of his contemporaries were also born around this same time, 1730s through 1760s. Think about that as I go on. These two preachers and several others began preaching revival services all up and down the colonies. They preached thousands of sermons in churches and fields where hundreds and thousands of people would gather. And I'm talking about 30 years of revival. David Barton says in his book, The American Story, quote, as a result, thousands were converted to Christianity and churches were filled. Today, this movement is often characterized as a national revival. However, it was really thousands of local revivals in so many communities across America that eventually the entire nation was changed. That is, the revival grew from families and towns outward to the nation, not from the nation inward to towns and families. I want to repeat that last part. The revival grew from families and towns outward to the nation, not from the nation inward to towns and families. So if the Great Awakening spanned 30 years from the 1730s to the 1760s, it's no surprise what an impact it had on the thinking of the colonists who were growing up during that time in the years leading up to the Revolution. If George Washington and many of his contemporary patriots grew up their whole lives in a time called the Great Awakening, a national revival, you can understand that they had a zeal for biblical principles and they were watching the growing tyranny of the King of England. And so ideas like consent of the governed and resistance to tyrants is obedient to God became very common and natural themes. It's important to remember the strong relationship between the Christian religion and civil government that was normal practice in the colonies. Now, everyone has probably heard that the colonists said, "No more kings," but it was actually more than that. A famous revolutionary rallying cry became, "No king but King Jesus." I want to read to you a short story. On April 18th, 1775, John Adams and John Hancock were at the home of Reverend Jonas Clark. British General Gage had announced to the colonists that if they would lay down their arms, all would be forgiven, except for Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were singled out as instigators. That same night, Paul Revere arrived at Reverend Clark's home to warn them that the Redcoats were approaching. The very next morning, British Major Pitcairn shouted to an assemblage regiment of Minutemen, the American patriots, "Disperse, ye villains, lay down your arms in the name of George, the sovereign King of England." Reverend Clark responded with what is known as the battle cry of the American Revolution. "We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus." And Reverend Clark became the leader of the militia in Lexington. Jonathan Mayhew, pastor of the West Church in Boston, said this: "It is evident that the affair of civil government may properly fall under a moral and religious consideration. For although there be a sense, and a very plain and important sense, in which Christ's kingdom is not of this world, his inspired apostles have nevertheless laid down some general principles concerning the office of civil rulers, and the duty of subjects, together with the reason and obligation of that duty. And it is proper for all who acknowledge the authority of Jesus Christ and the inspiration of his apostles to endeavor to understand what is in fact the doctrine which they have delivered concerning this matter. Civil tyranny is usually small at the beginning, like the drop of a bucket, till at length, like a mighty torrent or the raging waves of the sea, it bears down all before it and deluges whole countries and empires." Patriots argued that freedom was a gift from God and not one to be bestowed by governments only defended by governments. And they repeatedly wrote and spoke on this fact that without the Christian religion undergirding that freedom, it could not last. Samuel Adams, who is one of my favorite patriots, was the founder of the Sons of Liberty and the leader of the Boston Tea Party. And he said this: "The right to freedom is the gift of God Almighty. The rights of the colonists as Christians may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian church, which are to be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament." George Washington repeatedly noted in his diary of fasting and praying for God's direction and intervention in the cause of liberty. He also wrote down each instance where he believed God had miraculously intervened in the war against England. By the way, that's not the action of a deist. Deists believe that God created the world and since then has no further interest in what happens on earth. Deists will not fast and pray for God's intervention.